illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah.
So, discussing meditation, can you elaborate a little bit on the differences a little bit more from Islamic meditation, secular meditation, and other forms of meditation, such as Buddhist meditation or meditation that you find in yogic practices?
Sure. Yes. Inshallah. I'd be happy to. Yes. Kind of as we've mentioned earlier, there's of course, essentially historically, there's forms of meditation were always rooted in the sacred, in some kind of sacred civilization that had a sacred purpose, whether that's enlightenment or liberation. Kind of these sort of very sacred terms that were the ultimate spiritual end goal of self-realization, as a human being, as a human soul, or just simply being in a human state. Our release from samsara, for example, from in the Buddhist context, from suffering and from the world of change and suffering and forms. So this sacred intention, one can say, is really at the root of fitrah. The human soul made by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been made in such a way that it inherently recognizes the sacred, something that goes beyond the limitations of this realm. So this kind of seeking and searching is universal because it is connected to our underlying nature, what Islam calls the fitrah, right? What Taoism simply calls the Tao. All of this is aligned, the underlying nature. What is the underlying nature is also the essence of outer nature, the very substance and fabric of outer nature. From this angle, from an Arabic perspective, it's very interesting that the creator, al-Khaliq, has the name for the creator, who is God, is al-Khaliq, and the name for outer nature is al-Khalq. And the name for inner nature, inner character, is akhlaq. So these words are all related, right? The ultimate nature, and outer nature, and inner nature, like very much so as they are in the English language. They're related in their own way in the Arabic. So when we say this, I would say also for, I just mentioned the Tao. There is, the Tao, there's the Tao of things, and there's the internal Tao, right? And this would be in the Taoist context that there was a fitra'i contemplative awareness of a kind of, of a sacred balance of things, of the underlying nature of all things, rooted in what Muslims would call the spirit, or the ruh, right? Ar-ruh, the Holy Spirit. You have such words very synonymous in Hindu wisdom, which would be the Dharma. Also in Buddhist wisdom, this comes from Sanskrit. So the Dharma is the inner law or the innate law of things. Dharma also means proper duty, the proper rights of things upon others. This is the inner or the natural law of things. This particular word, we have two particular words in Islam for this. It's actually fitrah and haqq, the haqq of things. There's a haqq that you have over me. There's a haqq that I have over you. There's a right and responsibility that we have towards each other, but rooted in al-haqq, in the ultimate reality, in the ultimate truth, for whom there's a responsibility towards. And then we already mentioned the fitrah, the underlying nature that God has patterned all things upon, and that reflects somehow the divine nature, the fitratullah, as Allah calls it in Surah Al-Rum. So it's important to understand that all sacred civilizations who sought this kind of spiritual liberation, it's rooted in something sacred. We would even say, from an Islamic standpoint, something true. There's a calling, an inner calling that Rumi speaks of, the lament of the reed, that the reed has been torn or or broken from its, from its source, from the reed root. And so that root is the spirit. And so each human soul, however that's, understood in various civilizations and religions, are speaking of that severing and of that longing for the divine, for ultimate source, for realization, for happiness, for fulfillment, spiritually, not materialistically. So there's, in all of that, even in the longing, even in the sense of a modern person who may not believe in anything but just feels miserable, even that, aligned with suffering, which comes from Buddhist wisdom, in all of that, all of that points to the underlying nature of spirit, of the ruh, and the underlying, source of the human soul that it longs for it to come back to, the divine love, the divine presence, the oneness of God, God's lordship, rububiyyah over each soul. It's that longing. It's this movement of love, but it's encountered and experienced as suffering because we are not oriented towards source, capital S. So first, it's important to say that, and I would say that all forms of meditation, whether secular or sacred, seek to somehow, alleviate some element of suffering. So whether that's well-beingness in secular meditation, to relax our bodies and our minds, they're so agitated, so overcharged by our world. For today, we live such a fast life, we can't even, quote unquote, catch up to ourselves. So meditation is primarily, in this context, about simply catching up to ourselves, just stopping and being still, right? The famous biblical passage that be still and know that I am God. That amazing passage of the Psalms is really the essence of all real meditation. Even one who has a secular framework, they're really seeking this, to really just be still and find peace in this, that peace that surpasseth all understanding, as we find in the Bible also. But it may be limited by the worldview, by the framework. So the secular framework may not have a full awareness of what spiritual liberation is. But other more traditional and sacred civilizations, they have an awareness of this, right? Whether or not, from an Islamic standpoint, they're fully following their original revelations and their original prophecies is another matter. But that awareness stays, and there's a longing for that, and there's an attempt at trying to practice. Why? Because every human soul is endowed with the fitrah. And I would say that all of meditation is an attempt to return to the fitrah. Right? So I wanted to say that first about, just to give that context. So having said that, yes, as a Muslim, there's certain things, certain elements of secular meditation that can be helpful to calm the body and the mind, provided that they're not just performed, or they're not performed excessively to the point that they overshadow, astaghfirullah, any obligatory ritual or spiritual practice of Islam. Sometimes we need to do physical exercise to help our blood pressure, and we need to meditate to help calm the mind. All of that would then, according to sacred law, be important and even necessary for that individual. But if we begin practicing certain forms of yoga, in which we are then calling upon other deities or a particular lineage outside of Islam, we have to be careful about that. This is where then certain forms of sacred meditation and their internal rituals would simply not be advisable or allowable for a Muslim who is practicing meditation. Although, for example, I brought up yoga, they may benefit from certain hatha yoga practices, like certain postures and certain breathing patterns and certain holds. But if one goes further in these, like certain kundalini exercises, which then for certain, practitioners, they open onto spiritual states, this then is outside of the framework of Islam, and this would be problematic for the Muslim seeker, for the Muslim meditator, that one needs to be careful about this, because we're entering, kind of areas which would be just simply considered unprotected, kind of psychic and spiritual danger zones for the believer who has a very preserved and protected and pure way, a Muhammadan way, that comes from God and is preserved from God and comes back to God and leads back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way of the messenger, inwardly and outwardly. So I hope that maybe I did not answer what you were asking, entirely, but these would be the differences that I would say that the Muslim contemplative would respect, the diversity of practices of meditation, outside of their sacred form, outside the sacred form of Islam, and would recognize the sacred nature of Buddhist meditation, for example. But a lot of Buddhist meditation would not apply, to the Muslim. For example, if one enters a Vipassana retreat or something like this, there are certain elements of that practice, almost all of it, that would be to some extent problematic for the Muslim contemplative. And so it's important for us to understand that. So that's just one example. Although the underlying wisdom behind tasting Vipassana, for example, can lead you to an insight that's already in Islam or Islamic, but we do not need Vipassana to empty our minds and our hearts and to open ourselves to the divine presence, which for us takes us even further than any other practice. Contemplatively speaking and spiritually speaking, although certain practices that could be neutral, like conscious breathing, could be used as a kind of neutral framework, integrated into the Islamic perspective, and Allah knows best.
So I wanted to ask a follow-up on this,
Sure.
To make sure that I'm understanding clearly. That, from my understanding, that the various religious traditions, and then also non-religious traditions, each may have a type of meditation, but Islamically, we would take only that adhered to the Quran and the Sunnah, and not take anything else from them, because just like our own Islamic meditation has elements of ibadah in it that is geared towards how we see, or how our perception of Allah and how we relate to Allah. Same for the other traditions, that some of those elements would be ibadah for them. So then we wouldn't take from that.
Yes, it would be a form of worship for them, and not for us, and we couldn't take those practices. But what you're asking is a very good question. It's very subtle, though, and complicated, and I would say that not one size fits all. But in a general sense, one has to be careful about sacred practices, kind of borrowed from other religious traditions. It's just simply not how it works. From the point of view of integrating the body, mind, and the soul, body, mind, heart, and soul into Islamic spiritual realization, right? Yes, it would be up to spiritual authorities to see whether a particular practice could be integrated in some way, but by the inspiration of their integration is what we should be following, rather than an ad hoc, personal kind of picking and choosing. There's a danger. I understand that there's a value there. And in a very general sense, if we were to practice conscious breath work from a secular kind of mindset or framework, the believer could very easily integrate that. It's quite kind of neutral, but it's also limited to the nervous system and the body and the mind. But Islam itself has these practices that are sometimes simply just mentioned, like the Muhasaba, al-Nafs, or observing the breath, is a practice that was done very early in the Islamic spiritual tradition. And so we have it, and it's already been aligned in many spiritual, even Sufi schools of spirituality, with the remembrance of God, connecting the sacred breath with the divine name, with God's name. And so there are profound methodologies that perhaps arguably historically have taken certain practices and integrated them. but that integration has been done. And so we should follow those authorities who are, authorities in the spiritual way of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's important to understand that. The Muslim contemplative respects these other forms, but they're just simply not, part of our system. But there is a limit to how much can be integrated, right? But at the same time, there is a universality there is a universal dimension to the meditation experience. Simply as I kind of had mentioned at the beginning, an attentiveness to a particular object, relaxing or sinking in of the attention into its source as awareness, or the meditating subject, or the spiritual heart, and then an awakening to the recognition that this heart is our real nature, right? Kind of all of this, whether we speak of the human presence, the divine presence, or the prophetic presence in this, as I like to speak of and teach, those are universal. Like at least the things I mentioned, these three elements I mentioned at the beginning, which relate to the human presence. And in that one can see a universality in meditation practice. But as far as methodology and realization, the Muslim contemplative is rooted in their faith and in the worldview of their faith. And it is by the grace of God in that worldview and in that method that allows the human soul or the Muslim soul to be integrated and to fully realize and be established in a more permanent awareness of God, of taqwa and of hudur, of having a presence of heart with God, with God's presence, so that we stay internally in a state of mushahada, of spiritual witnessing, of the divine presence, which is the ultimate aim of what the Prophet ﷺ stated was the definition of Islamic spirituality, or spiritual excellence, or spiritual mastery, or spiritual beauty, in Islam, which is the heart dimension of Islam, which would be ihsan. So when he was asked about ihsan, what is spiritual beauty? What is spiritual excellence? The Prophet ﷺ stated, "In ta'budallaha ka'annaka tarahu, fa in lam takun tarah, fa innahu yarak." Which means, from the Arabic, which is also, if one knows the Arabic, it's in a very beautiful meter. It's in almost like a rhymed kind of meter. So it's said poetically, in ihsan, in beauty actually. When the Prophet ﷺ, he responded, he was asked about Islam and then Iman. In some of the riwayat, Iman first, and then Islam, and then ihsan, but Islam, Iman, and ihsan. What is submission, what is faith, and what is spirituality. So for spirituality, he stated that spirituality is to worship or to devote yourself unto God as if you see him. And if you don't see him, know or be aware that he sees you. So it's the second part, that trying to cultivate an awareness of God, that one is cultivating in Muraqaba, in Islamic meditation, and in all spiritual practices, to enhance our taqwa of Allah. So this second part of this prophetic statement describes taqwa, to be aware of God, to be aware that God sees you. So cultivating that is the beginning of Muraqaba, and it's the beginning of ihsan, of Islamic spirituality. And there's many modes of this, and one very direct mode is Islamic meditation, combined with invocation or the dhikrullah. The second part is what I was alluding to when I said that we should strive to be in a state of mushahada, of spiritually witnessing God's presence. To devote yourself unto God as if you see him. In ta'budallaha ka'annaka tarahu. Right? And so this would then be the ultimate, you could say, aim of the seeker of God in Islamic spirituality, who uses meditation, who practices meditation and invocation and contemplation and prayer, and makes their life and soul a prayer, that they relate to all things and they act in a manner as if, with courtesy unto God, as if they're seeing God in all circumstances, inward and outward, in public and private. And that's really the heart of Islam, the heart of Islamic spirituality.
لا إله إلا الله 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 لا إله إلا الله